Why do we learn about the Holocaust?
In today's world, it's more important than ever for people to learn that even when they are surrounded by hate, it is possible for them to do what is right.
I've asked myself a lot of tough questions about the Holocaust. What's your question?
How could this have happened?
How could human beings be so cruel to one another?
Why?
Why?
Why? Why is it so easy to teach people to hate?
How does someone go from being a neighbor or a friend,
parent or a husband or wife at home, and then do that to other people?
What would you do in that moment?
Is there a way for me to change the future based on what I've seen in the past?
Do you want to help break through ignorance and divisions that are plaguing our society? Join the conversation, then ask yourself what you will do about it.
Please welcome to the stage the former chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Council, Tom Bernstein.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a great honor to open our first Global Issues Forum. We're also pleased to welcome those of you joining through Facebook Live and the museum's website. And just starting here, I just want to thank Sarah Bloomfield and the phenomenal team at the Holocaust Museum that makes this all possible. So thank you. As we all know, the Holocaust raises some of the most difficult issues humanity needs to confront. The Holocaust starkly demonstrates the extremes of human behavior, the potential for unimaginable evil and for extraordinary good. We're repulsed by the evil, in awe of the good, and often wonder where we would be on the spectrum in times of crisis. Recent Holocaust research has revealed more about the majority of people who were not at the extreme ends of this spectrum of behavior, but somewhere in between. Yes, some were motivated by violent anti-Semitism. A few were motivated to help, even at great risk. But most were motivated by mundane impulses, such as fear, greed, resentment, and a desire for power. We also know that some moved in various directions along the spectrum of behavior, depending upon the situation. But, and this is a key lesson of the Holocaust, regardless of one's behavior, there was always a way to rationalize its necessity. Confronting the Holocaust means confronting harsh truths about ourselves. But if we hope, at the very least, to prevent group-targeted violence and genocide, and at the very most, to advance pluralism and social solidarity, these truths must be examined and constantly re-examined. That's the purpose of our Global Issues Forum on the Holocaust and human nature. Now a bit of information about the afternoon. There are 3 sessions, each with Q&A. You have index cards for your questions. Staff will collect them. Please take part on social media. Share your thoughts using hashtag USHMMForum, and Wi-Fi instructions are on your table. The museum is thrilled to welcome a global audience for the forum. More than 10,000 individuals from 25 countries in all 50 states shared on social media that they plan to watch this event live online. And nearly 30% of those viewers are young people between the ages of 17 and 24. This session and the last one are 50 minutes. After this session, we will have a short 5 to 10 minute break. Session 2 is across the hall and is 1 hour. You must be in your seats promptly because it is being recorded for later broadcast by the public radio program On Being. Now it's my great pleasure to turn this over to the moderator of our first panel, CNN analyst and former host of NBC's Meet the Press, David Gregory. Thank you.
How are you? Thank you. Good to see you. Hi, everybody. How are we doing? Welcome. Great to have you here. As was mentioned, this is the inaugural Global Issues Forum hosted by the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I'm very pleased to be here to kick off this conversation, which is about the Holocaust and human nature. I want to jump right into the discussion, but I do want to remind each of you that we're going to also take some of your questions. We have a period for Q&A. And so we'll hear from you. So if you're in the room, if you're not in the room, submit your questions. You can use the hashtag, as was mentioned, USHMMF form and hashtag AskWhy. And if you're in the room, you can use the cards that are at your table. Staff will be collecting them throughout the program. I've got a terrific panel here today, and let me introduce them, and then we'll get right into our conversation. I'll start with Dr. Ari Kruglanski, who I would like to note is one of the Holocaust survivors that the museum will be honoring this evening. Thank you for being here. We always can learn from our survivors, and we're honored by your presence. Dr. Kruglanski is a social cognitive psychologist at the University of Maryland, has been a pioneer in studying the psychological links between radicalization and terrorism. I'm also joined by Dr. David Anderson on the far side, an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and neuroscientist at Caltech, whose work focuses on the connections between brain science and emotion, with specific emphasis on aggression and fear. And also with us is Dr. Wendy Lauer. She's here with us. Dr. Lauer is an acting director of the museum's Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, a professor at Claremont McKenna College, and the author of Hitler's Furies, German Women, the Nazi Killing Fields, and examining what prompted ordinary women and men to commit extraordinary crimes to advance Nazi racist ideology. So as we get started, I wanted to put something as one of the elements for our thinking. The results of a study, we asked our audience what most influences hate. What most influences hate? Genetics or environment? And you can see the results. 80% of those we asked indicated that environment was most influential. Environment was most influential. So let's turn to you and ask our experts. Dr. Kruglanski, you said in an earlier interview that the 9/11 attacks had a profound impact on your work. What was it that had that impact? What was what was it about your work into terrorism and radicalization that you found was most profound?
For most Americans, the 9/11 event was a wake-up call. It shattered our conceptions of our invincibility. It revealed our vulnerability. For me, it was also a professional game changer. Prior to 9/11, I was doing my research on basic psychological processes, how people are motivated, how people think, what accounts for group dynamics. Mm-hmm. After 9/11, the substance of my research changed. I was appointed to be a member of the National Academy of Science panel to study terrorism, and that became the mainstay of my research ever since. The methods that I employed to study these phenomena also changed. Prior to 9/11, I was carrying out laboratory research in confines of the laboratory with college students as subjects. Post 9/11, I studied terrorists wherever I could find them. When our team traveled to Sri Lanka to study the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, all 12,000 of them. We studied Abu Sayyaf terrorists in a Philippine prison in Manila. We studied neo-Nazis in Germany. We studied white supremacists. So it was very different from the laboratory research, not as controlled.
So what was the game-changing element to the attacks for your research?
The game-changing element was that I realized that social psychology and psychology in general have a role to play in understanding a phenomenon that is of great importance to society. And it's incumbent upon us to recruit our ability to illuminate this phenomenon. And It's much more valuable to study that and to apply psychological knowledge in order to see how we can confront that problem, cope with it, possibly ameliorate it.
And is that to say that what you had was a more contemporary example of group hate, a desire for aggression, and a kind of psychological bonding that you hadn't seen in the aftermath of the Holocaust?
It brought to my mind the idea that human violence is a pervasive, ubiquitous potential that we all have. It's immanent in our nature. It's part of our repertoire. And it can be released at the drop of a hat. It can be released through virulent ideology. It can be released through a group dynamic that exists. And although the Holocaust differed in its magnitude and its scale and its immensity from the kind of terrorism and violent extremism that we see these days, the basic elements are the same. And we could talk about them subsequently.
Yes, we'll do that. I also want to point out, I've got a clock here to count down because nothing lasts forever, including this conversation. But the clock is not moving, which indicates maybe this conversation will last forever. But I want to just tell our organizers, because I don't want to look at my watch. There you go, you've collected it. Oh, and now, okay, now we have to say goodbye. Thanks everybody for being here. I feel really enlivened.
So now I have 3 more minutes.
No, that's it. No, you don't even have that. Now we're, this is like the final 4-shot clock, apparently. Dr. Anderson, you do work around aggression, as I described, involving mice and fruit flies, which is actually gets into the extent and the capacity for aggression, that it's instinctive versus learned. Tell us more about what you've learned from that and how it applies.
Sure. So I'm a biologist. I'm interested in how the brain controls behavior and emotion. And the issue of genetics and environment is very important. It's not an either or. Both genes and environment influence behaviors. And so the question is to figure out where in the brain and how environment and genes act to influence aggressive behaviors and related behaviors. So to study that, we work on simple genetically tractable model organisms. And we can do that because aggression is such an evolutionarily ancient and conserved survival behavior that you can see it all the way back to fruit flies. Male fruit flies will fight with each other. They don't fight to the death. They're more like sumo wrestlers. They push the opponent out of their territory, but they must have something to fight over. Just like people do, they have to fight over food, and they have to fight over females. And in fruit flies, genetics and environment do influence behavior. I don't know if they can show the video of the fighting fruit flies. Here we go.
Oh, wow.
Here are some fighting fruit flies. The fly reaches out and lunges down. We're not inferring that these flies hate each other, but this is a behavior. So what we've learned in flies is that genes and environment can affect aggression. You can breed fruit flies that are like the Rottweilers of Drosophila. They're very aggressive. You can also breed pacifist flies. But you can also influence their aggression. For example, flies that are isolated are much more aggressive than flies that are raised in groups. And that seems to be a general theme throughout the animal kingdom. And then in flies and in mice, if I could see the next movie, we've actually found the neurons in the brain that control aggression. Can you please run the next movie? If we activate these neurons using a technique called optogenetics, we can actually trigger aggression. Here you see a mouse which we have artificially triggered aggression neurons to get it to attack even an inanimate object. So this animal will attack anything that you put in front of it, pretty much.
So if we look at those 2 examples, what are we to, as we adjust your mic a little bit, what are we to make of that? How do you extrapolate from that to then apply it to human behavior and especially trying to understand our focus here today?
Yeah. So I think that's very difficult, and I'm always hesitant to extrapolate to humans, but I can tell you about things that seem to be conserved in mice and in fruit flies. So in both species, social isolation increases aggressiveness, and we now know that the same brain chemical promotes aggressiveness in both flies and in mice in response to social isolation. And our brains have the same evolutionarily ancient regions in the hypothalamus that the mice do, where aggression is controlled. So while I don't have direct evidence that we have aggression neurons in our brain, we very probably do. But the important point is these neurons have a huge braking system on them to keep them damped down and suppressed. And what probably happens in humans is that socialization activates that inhibitory system, those brakes on aggression, and the danger arises when the brakes are taken off.
So, Dr. Lauer, the society encourages certain beliefs and sets expectations for specific behaviors. In your book, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, you pull together numerous case studies of women who worked within the Nazi regime. They committed atrocious crimes. They did not express remorse during that time or even later in their lives. So how do we understand people who take these actions in furtherance of a cause? I think I've read other historians who make the point that there's an element that we have to understand about those who perpetrated the Holocaust, that many of them felt they were doing the right thing.
It's interesting in the two presentations we just heard about aggression as something that's kind of inherently biologically present in all of us. The capacity, the proclivity is there, and especially in men, and we can act out under certain circumstances. The women in Hitler's Furies were probably the most unlikely, on the surface, unlikely individuals who would act out in an aggressive way. The real challenge is to look at this historically as it escalates. So there's an element of chronology, of a dynamism over time, to place it over the time sequence. The regime was established in 1933, and by 1941, the massive extermination campaigns were underway with the invasion of the Soviet Union. So how is it that individuals who have this ability, this is anatomically shown, as you said, how does it become a system or a social practice of violence, a state condoned system of violence, an entire machinery? And these women that I looked at, this is Arna Petry on the screen, these are the worst examples of the 13 in the book. Most of the women were not these extreme killers. Most of them were accomplices working in the machinery and support roles that were critical to implementing a state-sanctioned policy of genocide. It's important to remember that. But at some point, there is this very, very core question of those who were least likely, the nurturing women, we think of as demure, and even our checks on some of this kind of violence in society. All of that was undone or lifted, as you said, the brakes came off. So what are the conditions that lead to that? And it's psychological, it's historical, situational factors. Holocaust research over the decades has focused on this very question of motivation. It's been a core issue. Although we're mostly historians working on this question, and that's why it's important for us to be in conversation, we've kind of dabbled in the work of my colleague Christopher Browning on peer pressure, for instance, Milgram's experiments. But so what are the things that bring this about? Well, we have obviously the whole combination of what we call the isms, right? These phenomena that cross time and space and generations: anti-Semitism, extreme nationalism, racism, various forms of prejudice that have no boundaries, as it were, and they get lodged hate, different ideas and fantasies of hate and fear. And then there's, of course, greed, fear, opportunism, careerism, just this whole complex of multi-causal factors that we have to be aware of, and we see them in the case of the Holocaust. They've been identified in individual forms and in collective forms. And how does that fit together what we know about our human biological capacity, emotional capacity to carry these atrocious acts out?
if I can,
yeah, please.
If I can jump in, you mentioned, David, that the perpetrators of these atrocities often felt very good about themselves. That's very important because terrorists who kill scores of people also feel very good about themselves, no remorse. And that's the reason that according to their ideology, what they are doing is lending them tremendous significance. They are becoming martyrs, they are becoming heroes, they are glorified, they are glamorous. And I think that is the underlying motivation. There are all these other factors, but underneath it all is this quest for dominance, quest for significance, quest for recognition, quest for respect. And of course, there are many ways of getting respect. Violence is a very primordial way of getting respect, getting dominance. Even flies do it, right. Mice do it. Even, as in the song, everybody is doing it. It's a very primordial, and it's very difficult to dissuade people to employ pro-social constructive means to significance. It's very direct link. Brute force, children do it, sophisticated nations do it, the nuclear club attempts to be very exclusive. So violence, a potential violence, is a ticket to dominance, ticket to respect, ticket to glamour.
Yeah, please.
One of the cases that was up there, Erna Petri, who actually killed 6 children, Jewish boys, on her farm outside the camp system. So not following any orders, held up a pistol that her father had given to her about 10 centimeters behind the heads of these boys. And she said in her confession, I wanted to prove myself to the men. I was isolated on this farm. I was indoctrinated. I was educated to hate Jews. I mean, these are very, very rare confession, very rare explanation, but the East German Stasi was able to kind of pull this from her. And these perpetrators, including others, I didn't speak to her, I spoke to her family, but I've interviewed some of these individuals, and they don't deny that the Holocaust happened, that millions of Jews were killed. They don't deny that. They defend themselves. They come up with psychological and legal defenses, but they deny their individual guilt, right? They say, it's an achievement for them in their mind that they carried this out.
Well, I have a question. I mean, what I'm hearing from all of you is there's a couple of factors, right? I mean, we often say in Judaism, right, that we should see God's face in other people, right? Because that's a reminder of that we're all God's creation and of our common humanity. Well, here was an effort to both dehumanize by saying there is this force that is oppressing you, to your point about creating, isolation for Germans after World War I and Versailles, and that this is a bigger force, almost a monstrous force. It's not a human being because they're really not human beings, which helps to eliminate some of the traps that people can fall into. How can I kill this child? But if you no longer see that as a human being, that child is a human being, then it gets easier, right? You want to start with it?
Yeah, I think it's important to bear in mind that aggression is not unitary. There's different kinds of aggression. Mm-hmm. There's territorial aggression, which is what we study primarily in mice and flies. There's defensive aggression, if you're attacked. And then there's predatory aggression. And we know that the brain circuits for predatory aggression are very different from the brain circuits for territorial aggression. And it's occurred to me, this is just a speculation, but perhaps the dehumanization of the other is a step that allows humans to switch into a mode of predatory aggression rather than territorial aggression, which is usually with other members of your species.
And predatory can be defensive.
Yeah.
Right?
It can. But here's the difference between mice and men. That although mice and men try to be dominant through violence, we have cognition, we have ideology, we have a way of explaining away why it is that we perpetrate aggression and violence and kill millions of people. We make them into infrahuman cockroaches and monkeys and dogs. They are not human. They do not deserve consideration.
Right.
So the ideology of it is very important because we have all this civilization that prevents us from employing aggression in the service of dominance and in the service of glory. But an ideology is a way of getting around it. We can twist the argument in a way that would portray what we're doing as something in the service of value rather than undermining of human value.
And to that point, I have a question here about the role that communal involvement and developing personal relationship plays in displays of violence. I mean, here, I think about 9/11, right? There is a brotherhood. There's the predatory aspect of it that is seen as defensive, that is seen in terms of global jihad and a kind of returning to kind of base principles. And it's such an honor to be part of that group fighting in that struggle, which is not that different than Nazi ideology, which is a pursuit of a kind of perfection of the world in their twisted way of looking at it.
The social element is very important. We are social beings. We validate our sense of reality through agreement with other people, members of our group who we respect. So in our understanding of it, there are three elements. There is the motivation for dominance and significance. There's the ideological narrative that explains why violence is serving significance. And the third element, which you just mentioned, is the network, the social network that validates the narrative. Without it, people are very unable to create their own reality. Even the lone wolves that we have seen are usually wolf packs. There is always a social dynamic element that creates the shared reality that to kill is a good thing rather than
Do any of you have a thought, when you say the social network, I was taking that to the digital extreme, right? If we speak about the Holocaust, how do we talk about the creation of ideology and the distribution, the proliferation of ideology in this digital climate that allows, dehumanization and caricature, and that's just in our daily politics, let alone, in something as murderous as this. Anybody have a thought on that kind of contemporary example?
Well, in the Nazi example, the forms of building this kind of social cohesion around the ideology and the fantasy of eliminating the globe of Jewry as the threat, right? And believing that was something that could be realized was operated in all different realms. Here we have a photo of nurses being sworn in on the way to war, and the militarism, the rearmament of Germany and the empowerment of that, and we're part of a greater cause under the veil of patriotism, which is operating through rituals like the swearing-in ceremony, in the school system, in the Kameradschaft evenings that Himmler planned for the SS men, in the Nuremberg rallies. So in all the ways, there were elements of what we see today in modern society of the use of mass media, the use of propaganda, the use of theater. There's so many ways in which this can create the mobilization of society towards these ends.
Does this tend to be geared more toward men than anyone else? I mean, I think about what Putin does. There's a book that's out by a Guardian correspondent called The Long Hangover about the Putin years, and how so much of what goes on in Russia is about reviving the World War II narrative about Russians kind of a return to their military greatness, that we see strains of with President Trump about making America great again. This idea of militarism and strength and nationalism. Is it just a male phenomenon?
I can say a little bit about the biology of that. So in most species, there is what you call sexual dimorphism in aggression. Males are more aggressive than females, and that's true in fruit flies, and the aggression neurons that we've discovered in fruit flies are present in the male brain and not even present in the female brain. It's not that female flies don't fight, they do, but they use different neurons. Now, in mice...
Who knew there was so much going on with fruit flies?
Yeah, exactly.
I always wonder, like, where do they come from? Like, the fruit is here, and all of a sudden they got in somehow.
Spontaneous generation.
Is that...
No.
No.
Also...
Sorry. That's the next panel. Where do fruit flies come from?
Also, in mice, there are sex differences, not as obvious as in flies, but there are clearly sex differences in neurons in the brain regions that control aggression.
I'm not trying to be flip here, but I am curious, because you showed the video before of the WWE fruit fly smackdown. But what are they fighting over in this instance?
They are fighting over food in that case. If we give them females, they will fight over females. They have to have something to fight over. If you just put 2 fruit flies on a plastic dish, 2 male fruit flies, they won't fight with each other. But as Dr. Kruglanski said, this drive is in competition with other drives. So if the flies are starved and you put 2 flies on food, they will eat first before they fight with each other. So there's this internal tension.
So they really are just men. I mean, this is basically all male behavior.
We haven't done the experiment with females, I have to say.
Okay.
But getting to the point about tipping the balance in these networks, and your question about media, people in emotion speak about something called social contagion of emotion, and it's that it can spread from one person to another. And there are clear studies in rodents showing, for example, that if you scare one rat, it can communicate that fear to another rat that didn't directly experience the thing that scared it. And so there may be something similar in terms of aggression, where there is a social amplification, as it were, of aggression, and that spreads it through a population.
So I want to, by the way, if you have your own questions about fruit flies or anything else, we can collect them from the staff. But I do want to I want to make sure that maybe I'm reflecting what people in the room are thinking. But, understanding the Holocaust and human nature, I want to keep bringing it as present and contemporary as I can. What do you think we now know that sheds light on this event that we didn't know before? Doctor, what do you think?
Well, I think we know that there are these 3 components that are pervasive and that account not only for Holocaust and the modern-day terrorism, but also for the Crusades. The same, you mentioned nationalist ideology, the narrative of Second World War. It doesn't have to be of that content. It can be the defense of Christianity against Islam that gives people a sense of significance and religious purity. It can be an ethno-nationalist ideology that motivates Sri Lankan Tamils to perpetrate bombings and murder of politicians and so forth. It can be a socialist ideology of the Bader-Meinhof kind. So the content of the ideology does not matter. The idea is that values lend people significance if they serve those values. People crave significance, and there is a group that supports that kind of link between the violence and the significance. And that is what we have learned, and this is a universal phenomenon that spans history, spans space and time. I think we now understand it, and it has parallels in brain mechanism. We were just talking with David Anderson about the fact that there are cases in which one type of concern, one type of motivation becomes dominant, everything else is pushed aside. At 9/11 it was security, and it pushed aside concerns about human dignity, human values, privacy, the unacceptability of torture. Once that becomes significant and dominant, release on behavior occurs, and it's possible to adopt behaviors that otherwise would be unthinkable.
Dr. Lauer, what do you think?
Well, I think the Holocaust absolutely, very starkly, very shockingly illuminated genocide and our capacity to commit this, and it's necessary that institutions of power are behind this. We've been talking about individual acts of violence. These are men in uniform killing this woman in Ukraine, in Mariupol, Ukraine. I've been working on these photographs. So the capacity is there. Genocide, we have an ancient history of it, but the Holocaust is by far the most well-documented, and it provides an incredible opportunity for us to learn from this history. If we're going to say never again and we're going to prevent this, here we have the institutions of the Holocaust Museum, of other research institutions around the world. We can actually sit down and study it and learn from it. This image, very disturbing image, this is, this is a fact, right? This is not a hoax. This is what happened. We have to defend this fact of this innocent woman being shot at close range here in the killing fields of Ukraine. The man who took this photograph, I've been studying him, you've got 2 Ukrainians there and Germans, and now we have a Slovakian photographer who took this image, who was a guard. And it looks like from that image that he was a collaborator, quote unquote, a collaborator, and somehow complicit. Well, it turns out that he was, as he said, he found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he took these photos because he actually was trying to testify against what had happened and was smuggling these images out, and even donated his camera to the Jewish Museum in Bratislava. His name is Lubomir Skrovina. And here I am actually looking at the camera. That was just personal, kind of. As a researcher, I was absolutely over the moon having that camera in my hand. But actually, this camera is a very important source, and at the museum, we opened up a new conservation education center with housing all these artifacts. And I just want to say very briefly that I've worked a lot on documentation, Nazi documentation, and that kind of empirical study. And to have that camera in my hand actually is very helpful and illuminating. It turns out that that camera takes 120 millimeter film. And that means that the film that my photographer had at that massacre on October 13th, 1941, he could take 8 pictures. That's as many as he could take. We have 7 of them. And that shows you why he deliberately took in a kind of sequence what he was trying to document, and that was his testimony of what happened. So
it raises the point of what we've learned, the question of what we've learned about the ability for people to resist what is counter to their own values. Where are we? Are we more fortified as societies to be able to resist this kind of action?
It's very difficult to resist alone. Social psychological research suggests that you need allies, you need other people. There was a very famous social psychological experiment on conformity. Subjects are presented with a standard line and a bunch of comparison lines. And it's clear that one of the comparison lines is equal in size. And that's the task of the subject, to tell which of the comparison line is equal in size to in this particular case, it's line B that is equal in size, or yeah, line B. But other subjects who are confederates of the experimenter says, no, it's C. What does the subject do in that circumstance? Two-thirds of the subjects conform. Even though the evidence of their own eyes tells them it's B, they go along and say C. But, and this is the important point, when even one other subject supports the individual and tells him, you're right, this is B, the conformity disappears. So it's easy to resist the pressure if it's contrary to your values, to your perceptions, if you have allies. And in fact, most of the underground, the resistance movements, were movements of social movements that consisted of mutually supportive individuals. So it's very difficult to resist pressure alone. It's much easier to do it if you have others who partake with you with this understanding.
William Shirer wrote in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich that in the early part of the Nazi aggression and before the full nature of the Holocaust, there was this collective sense among Germans of like, yes, this is crazy, some of the the crackdowns and so on, but what are you going to do? I mean, what are we going to do about it? How does that play in, that passivity at that point?
One thing I would say is that biology is replete with what we call cooperative phenomena. It's the kind of thing that Ari is talking about. If everybody is doing it, more people are doing it. And the faster more people do it, the more quickly it grows. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, it is possible to take it apart if there are forces pulling it in the opposite direction. So I think what we've learned is that civilization, as we think of it, is inherently fragile, and that pluralistic civilizations are even more fragile, and they're held together by a string of a network of cooperative interactions, and it doesn't take much to make the entire thing unravel. But what's necessary to prevent that unraveling, as Ari says, is group activity pushing back in the other direction.
So, Wendy, I think it goes to the point of then, how do we educate ourselves to be able to overcome aspects of human nature that can lead to the Holocaust? And I think about, anti-Semitism on the rise throughout the world that has the connective tissue of digital media that allows it to spread so quickly, but so does the reaction to it. That we can see in mass rallies that are organized through social media, the ability to stand up to it and to call it out for what it is. You have these dual phenomena. One is so virulent in its capacity as, its cohesive capacity, but so is the other as a tonic. Where do you, so?
Well, it's so true. I just came from a lecture tour in Germany, and Germany is a paradigmatic example of a culture that, on the one hand, has continuity with the Third Reich. Major Nazis continued serving in the post-war German government, and there have been a proliferation of neo-Nazi groups from 1945 till now. Now, the Alternative für Deutschland is in the Bundestag. But on the other hand, there is a counterforce. German society, German mainstream society, is more than any other society that I know of, resolutely opposed and organized against that. There is more organizations, NGOs and others in Germany that attempt to curb the neo-Nazi time of sentiment. And so there is a struggle between these two movements, and Germany, who experienced firsthand the atrocities of Nazism, is also on the forefront of trying to combat virulent anti-immigrant, anti-xenophobia, and so forth.
Wendy, comment on my question, and then I'll get to some other questions.
I just want to stress what I think all of us know, but I think bears repeating and really thinking about the value of education. The value of education starting with secondary all the way through your life, to play, for us as a community, a global community, to really continue to invest and support open inquiry, deep inquiry, reflective inquiry. This, as the 21st century, I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be how to keep people's attention and how to foster the kind of critical inquiry and questioning, and with an eye towards the betterment of society, and some of these, even returning to some of these bigger values of progress and and you mentioned empathy. I mean, the Nazis had a functioning school system, a functioning university system, but it was indoctrination. It wasn't education. They were bringing youth on field trips to the asylums, as they called them, to have them stare down the so-called inferiors, the deformed, and to try to train them to unwire their sense of empathy and any kind of humility. So it's really just, I think, critical, and I'm an educator, so of course that's my bias, but I do think that this is where you'll see this today with the Parkland students. I mean, those are smart students, right, that are coming out and speaking out and surprising us all, or university students. But to have that open inquiry is absolutely essential, and it's diminishing in Eastern Europe with the criminalization of those who bring national shame to their study of the Holocaust and studies of collaboration. So it's really a fundamental piece to all of this in terms of the potential for escalation and how that comes from this social networking and cohesion.
So a number of really interesting questions here. One from Facebook: does the current climate in the world show that hate is becoming more viral? What are the best ways to fight this hate, which I think we've been discussing? Dr. Kruglanski, one thing that I experience in the media a lot, I have a feeling, I do not like comparisons to Nazi Germany, because I think you should only compare Nazi Germany to Nazi Germany. And it's such a toxic thing to bring up. It totally shuts down the conversation. And so I think it's fair to look at totalitarianism or tyrannical or authoritarian behavior but we can pollute our conversations by saying, "Oh, you sound like a Nazi." How do you feel about that? Do you feel that they can be overly sanitized and that we should wade into it if we feel the comparison is appropriate?
I think it's a very good question. It's a perplexing question because there is a great deal ambivalence as to the uniqueness of the Holocaust. On the one hand, it's the pinnacle of atrocity, unprecedented in history, in its duration. It's in mechanical, systematic extermination of people. There was nothing like that. On the other hand, however, the human capacity for atrocity is documented day in, day out. Only yesterday, children were gassed in Syria. The Myanmar Rohingya were massacred. There is Rwanda, there is Biafra, there is South Sudan. People are killed. The capacity demonstrated in the Holocaust is not isolated to the Holocaust. So while recognizing its uniqueness and remembering the atrocity, it's also important to understand that it's not isolated to a given time and place, to a given set of actors, but it's an immanent capacity of the human nature. Anybody, almost anybody, can become extreme under the right or rather the wrong circumstances.
I think I think this kind of labeling too is problematic. It does shut down conversations. Mm-hmm. If you say to someone, point the finger, say, "You're a Nazi, you're a racist, you're an anti-Semite," that's a form of kind of condoning and not understanding. I mean, what you're trying to do is figure out where are these forms, these ideas coming from? What is generating this? What's the potential of it? How do we monitor it? When do we intervene? I mean, this is a different way, I think, of analyzing that situation. I think more constructive than, as you say, shutting down conversation.
Yeah, there's another question here, Dr. Anderson. Are you saying that we isolate individuals when we are repulsed by them? If so, how do we overcome the instinct for the sake of society? There is a way, Tim Snyder writes in Bloodlands, that this tendency to basically dismiss someone as sort of insane or incomprehensible is to kind of abandon history and to isolate them instead of saying, I can understand, some of the motivation here, some of the fear, some of the insecurity, that would create this predatory nature. How do you answer what's being asked here?
Well, I think one of the most important things that one can do early in education is to inculcate empathy for the other. Particularly with the spread of immigration in the world due to war, politics, and increasingly climate change. Right. We have societies becoming increasingly heterogeneous, and I think there's a strong drive of tribalism in human nature, and one of the things that is critical to keep civilization from fragmenting is for students and children to be raised in constant contact with that diversity and to learn that we're all human beings, and to develop empathy and compassion for people who are different than you. And if it's once you lose that things start to unravel. So I see that as being a critically important step, and it makes me concerned about the increasing trend to homeschooling in the United States, because homeschooling does precisely the opposite. It isolates children, it minimizes their contact, not only with peers in the same group, but certainly with those in different kinds of groups.
And how about just the siloing effect of media? I bet everybody in this room has a media source or sources that might be exclusive of other sources and might even tend to reinforce your view of the world, which is very comfortable, but we live in a society where we're not so much looking to be enlightened, but to gain ammunition for our dialogue. And it's easy to delegitimize the other when there's a coarsening of views. So I think that's a really important point.
To jump into, I very much agree with you, David, about the importance of learning to appreciate or empathize with others who are different from yourself. There is a contact hypothesis in social psychology that suggests one of the best ways of reducing prejudice is through contact with people who are different from you. There is now a Living with Differences movement out of Boston University. I recently participated in a meeting in Uganda with that group who try to train people to live with people who are very different in terms of their beliefs. That said, it's easy to create a division, a partition between people by pointing out to a dimension of difference that now becomes sanctified. So, for example, former neighbors in former Yugoslavia who lived together, or Shia and Sunni who lived in Iraq in peace and harmony. Once that dimension of the religion or the ethnicity becomes a rallying cry, then all bets are off, and the ideology can turn erstwhile neighbors into deadly enemies.
Yeah. What do you want to point
Well,
out?
I was just thinking about during the Nazi era and the interwar era, really starting in the late 19th century with the rise of racism and the notion that purity or homogeneous society was really a source of strength. And then the emotions of fear and aggression, that somehow this was part of the equation, the extent to which that was not even, discussions of pluralism and of living together as a way of, safeguarding against genocide and against violence and ultimately, the end of our race, if genocide were to become, globally systemic, because it really is a kind of suicidal mission if you think about it, that was not part of the thinking, in the interwar period. That was not the operative ideology.
Well, and I even have to say, again, I think, the current state of our politics, as someone who's seen a lot and covered a lot of this, worries me so much because at the individual level, I have seen an incapacity to speak to one another. That the topic is so verboten that you can't even go there. Because it doesn't, ideology can be divisive, and I think this and you think that, but it's much more deeply felt than that. It's that you are associating yourself with someone that I don't even want to associate myself with, and therefore I don't want to associate myself with you. Mm-hmm. And I see this play out in the debate about gun rights. We certainly see it play out in religion and other areas, but I think in our politics it's very deep. David, are there other environmental factors? There's an interesting question here about aggression on a large scale. Is it linked to a changing environment, polluted water, et cetera? Certainly scarcity of resources can lead to aggression.
Yeah, I think that's very clear that competition for access to resources is a major driving force for aggression throughout the animal kingdom. If you make food scarce, animals will fight over food, water. That happens in people as well. Mm-hmm. So that's an extremely important source of environmental pressure. I think a critical thing that hasn't been mentioned is the value of economic interdependence in heterogeneous and pluralistic societies. The more that groups are dependent on each other to make a society work, the less chance there will be for things to pull apart. And one has seen this, for example, in pre-Inquisition Spain, where Jews and Moors lived and worked together, that where there are strong economic ties that are complementary, it makes it possible for the society to overcome limited access to resources like you were describing, mm-hmm. and as a collective group to work together to overcome those things rather than splintering and fragmenting into separate subgroups, each competing for access to those resources.
But I just want to mention that the irrational part of this, it's very tempting to try to, as intellectuals, to try to come up with a kind of set theory or an understanding that seems kind of what we can get our arms around because it's rational, but so much of the Holocaust was irrational. When I think about Jewish communities that were integrated economically in Europe and were vital to those communities, and that the destruction of those communities in places like Ukraine, the impact of that to this day of down to poverty and these centers of these towns, the town in Mariupol that we just saw, they're like, I call them ghost shtetls. I mean, there's really such a loss, such a tremendous loss. And so that thinking is not part of the calculation. It might be immediate part of the calculation. I would like this house, I would like this material possession. But the long-term impact is just, it's not based on any kind of a rational view into the future.
Rationality is in the eye of the beholder. Rationality, according to the great theorist of rationality, Max Weber, Durkheim, and others, is selecting the means to your goals. But the goals can change. The goals depend on the human motivation. So the idea that economic independence can make a community work for a while, but once an alternative motivation is aroused, such as your ethnic pride, your nationalism, the sense of being insulted by historical events, that takes over. I remember that in Israel, Moshe Dayan at one point thought that creating an interdependence between the West Bank and Israel is going to ameliorate the situation, and people would do what is rational in the economic sense. But that, as we know, till this very day, this morning, this is not working. So national pride, the sense of significance that comes from your culture, can override any economic benefits, and people are willing to sacrifice their lives even on the altar of causes that they deem valuable.
Before we conclude, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I want to remind you that you have about 10 minutes, maybe you have less than that. Maybe it's already started, who knows? My clock says just do what you feel, so it's weird. Across the hall in the Independence Ballroom, the next conversation, what is driving the rise of white supremacy and neo-Nazism, and how can we counter it? These are all big upper conversations. These are good. And that's Public Radio's On Being with Krista Tippett is recording that segment, so doors will close promptly when they close. And you're not going to be able to get in, so you'll only have however much time you have to get over there. I will also tell you that Dr. Anderson has made his signature T-shirt, Fight Like a Fruit Fly, available outside, so be sure to pick one of those up. It's always nice to have a few laughs in the middle of a discussion of mass murder, so we want to do that. Thank you all very much. Interesting conversation. Thank you all.